Hi, this is Dr. Sezin Zengin. Today we are together with Dr. Jordan Norris, a postdoctoral researcher from Aarhus University in Denmark, also assistant professor of economics from NYU Abu Dhabi University.
Hi.
Hi. Today we will be talking about international trade. Very welcome, Doctor.
Good to be here, thank you.
All right, let's talk about the gains from international trade first.
Yeah, as an economist, we'd say that the gains from trade are positive, that countries should open to trade. However, what people hear from this is make trade free and everyone will benefit. But that's not quite true because there are winners and losers from trade. So as a consumer, if the country opens to trade, then you can buy more goods, you can consume an iPhone, right? Because the iPhone's developed in the US. If you didn't trade, then you couldn't have your iPhone. So as a consumer, trade is good. But as a laborer, then there are winners and losers, because if you're in a job for which you start importing from, take if you're a manufacturer, then when you start trading with China, you're going to lose your job and China's going to take all these jobs instead.
So it hurts the companies as well, right? Not just the laborers.
Yeah, it hurts both. So the company may go out of business and all of its workforce will too. And so when a country opens to trade, this creates winners and losers depending on which industries you're in. And so the economist doesn't say let free trade, we should just make trade free. Importantly, we need to compensate these people who lose. It's that those that win, the gains more than offset those that lose out.
Yeah, but these consumers and the laborers are the same people.
Yeah.
It's just managing people's behaviors in both ways. So let me ask you, what policies there should be to protect the labor supply of individuals?
Yeah, one answer to that and what many countries are doing these days is protectionism. So if you're concerned about your manufacturing industry, then you could place tariff on imports in manufacturing. So imports of cars, for instance. Then consumers in your own country would just purchase domestic cars instead because the foreign cars are more expensive. So this will help your manufacturing industry, but at the expense of other consumers and other industries, because now if you're in the UK and you want BMWs, well now they're going to be more expensive to you because you're putting taxes on these. So import protectionism, as an economist at least, is not the way to go. What the policy should be is helping those that are hurt by trade. So those who are in the car manufacturing industry, we should have policies in place to help retrain these people who are negatively affected.
All right, and let me ask one other question. In this case, we should be careful about people's, individuals' choices about from both sides, the consumption behavior and the labor behavior, and we are protecting the laborers from their own mistakes and also allowing them to purchase everything. So free trade is kind of like free trade between their consumption and labor behavior as well, if there is a free trade. So putting tariffs, it's not working for many countries, but currently there is a debate going on in the US. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, in the US currently with President Trump, he's taken a very opposite approach than his precedents, and now is starting to put tariffs massively, particularly on goods from China, to help protect the domestic manufacturing industry, because these workers at least are heavily hurt by this the imports from China. However, this in the long run is not the way to go, because we want the industries that are not competitive in our country. We don't want non-productive industries to succeed. So in the US right now, by Trump putting tariffs on goods from China, effectively what's that doing is at the expense of all the other consumers. We're protecting firms in the US that are just not very productive anymore. Really what we want to happen, at least in the long term, is that these non-productive industries, these ones that are wasteful in terms of resources, perhaps are paying their managers too much, not improving their workforce, we want to let those businesses eventually go out of business so that more productive businesses can succeed and so benefit the economy.
But the main reason US is doing that is because of that very high trade deficit. So would you like to comment on the trade deficit? Is it something bad for an economy?
Yeah, with the trade deficit, a lot of people talk about this as being bad, but this is not a meaningful statement, because all the trade deficit is, it's an accounting identity. It says that your amount of imports to a country is less than your exports from that country. So saying the trade deficit is bad is not really telling you anything. Importantly, it's what's causing this trade deficit. And that's where you should make the question. So maybe in your country, if your consumers are taking a lot of debt and just spending this money on alcohol and cigarettes, then that's probably not a good thing to do. But taking a lot of debt is the same as having a trade deficit. So it's true that if you run a trade deficit, your country is getting into more debt. But it depends what you're spending this debt on. So if it's just on luxury consumption goods, then the trade deficit is bad. And so maybe in Turkey also, the consumption behavior is for luxury and taking on credit to spend that. So that may not be good, because in the future, how are you going to repay this debt if you just spent all the money on alcohol and cigarettes, for instance? But what can be good is if you're spending this credit instead on investment. So for productive goods, like technology, so that in the future, when you do have to repay this debt, then you can. So in that case, a trade deficit is good. And so typically we think, and what we teach to the students is that in developing countries, trade deficits can be good because it allows the developing countries to invest in their industries while still consuming now, because they're able to take loans to fund consumption and fund investment at the same time.
Okay. What about the other side? If somebody borrows money, for sure somebody should lend it. What about the trade surplus of the countries?
Yeah, and then the countries in the world that are running trade surpluses, the dominant player in this is China. And in the US, taking the US and China right now, the trade deficit of the US is about $300 billion to China. So China's lending the US $300 billion each year. And so from the standpoint of China, this may be seen as good policy because they're making all these investments in other countries and they're going to get the return from this in the future. So that's a good factor of it. But then it depends on what are the consequences of this, what are the costs. So one of the costs right now is that the consumers in China, they're saving all this money and investing it abroad. But they could, instead of being saving so much money, they could just spend it on consumption right now and maybe improve their welfare. But instead, through policies of the Chinese government, they're not able to consume as much, which they may want to. I mean, if you look at the US or the UK or these other countries, we don't save that much. Maybe in China too, the consumers also would like to save a little less and consume a little more.
Okay, but from this point of view that the countries who have trade surpluses, they are the lower consumption countries, while who borrows the money consumes more. And if we look at the way to suit consumption over the time, I think the balance should be the other way, right, for the future. So those countries who save right now will be able to consume more in the future.
Right. Yeah, in a canonical economic theory, we would say just this, that
yes.
The developing
What
ones
happens if not?
the developing ones should run the trade deficit, not the trade surplus. That is, the developing ones should be borrowing money. But yeah, in China, it's the reverse.
Yes.
The developing country is lending to the rest of the world. And it's a curious result that is happening. And a lot of the theories about why is this going on, it's because of the policies that China has put in place. So in certain ways, they force the citizens to have high rates of savings. They restrict their investment opportunities. They restrict how much they can invest abroad. And so instead, they can only lend to the government in effect, which the government then invests abroad for them. And so is this good or bad? Well, it's interesting too how this then relates to what about the countries that they're lending to. So as I said before, the US is a big beneficiary of this credit from China. And so is this good? Is this good for the US? Is this good for China? Well, you can make an analogy with yourself if you owe money to the bank. If you owe the bank $1,000, then that's bad for you because you're going to have to pay this debt in the future. But if you owe the bank $1 billion, then this is bad for the bank because if you don't pay that, then the bank is down $1 billion. And in some ways, this resembles what's going on with China and the US because China is lending the US huge amounts of money with the expectation that the US will one day repay, and that is certainly their plan. But these are big sums of money, and the future, it's a long time until they will see this money back.
Okay, and if you take the same example and carry to the UK issue, then right now people in UK vote against being part of European Union just because of very same reasons. And now, what do you think about the effects of Brexit will be in the sectors?
Yeah, Brexit. So being from the UK, yeah, I see a lot about this, and yeah, the reason there is that workers feel that trade policy is not working for them, and in many ways that they're true. The UK government has liberalised trade over the years, and this has benefited some industries at the expense of others. So what I was saying earlier, and so for labourers, for people and firms that are in these industries that are hurt, they are rightly so not too happy now with the current system, and hence have voted for Brexit. Really, what the trade policy and the domestic policy should encompass is not just simply reducing trade costs with the rest of the world. We need some accompanying domestic policy that helps these workers that are hurt by these trade policies. So if you're in an industry such as manufacturing that has been hurt by these reduction in trade costs, the government should help them retrain or give them some form of compensation so that they can get back on their feet and still live a productive life. And it's curious too, because then there's a question about free market versus like socialism, and maybe this compensating certain workers seems away from free market and more towards socialism. But even from the people who benefit from trade, then this should still be important to them. So in the UK, the economy is practically dominated by the financial services industry, and all of this is located in London. And as trade has become more free, as we become more integrated with Europe, then this financial centre in London has flourished because they can access the European Union with very little trade costs. But what's happened over the years is that because the rest of the country outside of London has not been compensated or helped to retrain, now they voted for Brexit, which has cut off the financial access from London to Europe, which is now causing a lot of these firms in London, these financial firms, to leave or lay off workers. So in effect, what seems like would be bad for the financial workers, they would have to initially compensate the manufacturing workers. Well, now it's actually turned out bad for them because they've all just voted for Brexit, which is going to ruin, to some extent, aspects of the financial industry in London. Okay,
and how do you see the future of economy in UK after Brexit?
Yeah,
what will be the overall consequences or benefits?
It's always hard to predict. The costs from Brexit, I think, may not be too high. I think the biggest costs really are in the transition. So right now, depending on whether we go for a hard or a soft Brexit, depending on how much we actually break from the EU, then making that transition could be really tough. And so you can take extreme examples where if we have no deal at all, then even flights leaving the UK can't fly into Europe. And so if there's no deal at all, that means, for myself, I'm going back in a month to the UK, and I'm going to be flying from Denmark to the UK. So if we have completely no deal, then this flight legally can't make that journey. So some form of deal is needed just for these little things, right? And so it really depends on what the deal is for how in this short run, in this transition, we're going to be affected. But in the long run, it's probably not the biggest problem, but making it more difficult to trade with your nearest trading partners, your nearest countries, at least is going to have some cost, for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right. And do you have any other comment about international trade you want to mention? No,
I think we covered everything.
Thank you very much. Thanks once again.
Thank you.